It's a privilege to be here, and it's slightly scary. I'm used to having an hour to talk and to hide behind my slides. I have neither of these today, so I wondered, as I was thinking about it to myself, what can I say that will mean something to you in 10 minutes? And perhaps the easiest way to convey that is to use a story. So rather than give you some facts and figures, I'm going to tell you a story, but as you're listening to the story, I want, if you could think about the connection between our minds and our bodies and our environment. And by environment, I mean our community, as well as the environment in which we live. Before I begin the story, I want to make two distinctions. When we think about climate change, we can use the term loosely, climate change, but actually it's important to make two distinctions. The first is, we think about climate change, climates are variable. Climates aren't static. We define climates, we define them as an average. Climates are changing. They change independently of what we may or may not do. But in addition to that, there's something that we can also think about, which is global warming or anthropogenic change, change that we created, change that our actions are imposing on the world, a type of pollution. So when I'm talking about climate change today, I'm not talking about that natural variability, the climates that change outside of human action, but actually the climates that change because of human action. So let's look at my story. Well, the story is actually based on one that was told in the late 1990s, at a time when the global ramifications of global climate change, anthropogenic change, was being identified. And the guy who first wrote it is a guy called Stanley Changnyong, and he was the state hydrologist for Illinois. So I've changed the story a little bit and made it my own, but it was rooted in his story originally. So I want to take you back to the 1800s. If you can imagine a group of Shawnee Indians living on the plains of the Mississippi. They're floodplains. The Shawnee Indians live essentially in harmony with nature. They live on the floodplains. Every spring, the Mississippi River floods, and they move their settlement up onto the higher ground. Then, when the floods have gone, they go back onto that fertile land and grow their crops. They fish the river, they grow maize, they live in tents. They are entirely dependent on the land, and they are at its mercy. They have lived, essentially, adjusted to the environment, they have adjusted to their climate. Now along comes a medicine man, and he sits them down and he says to them, look, in 100 years' time, the climate is going to be 2 degrees warmer. Your river is going to flood more often, but this time when it floods, the rains will be so severe it's going to wash away all your fertile lands. Your lifestyle as you're living it now will not be possible. And the Indians turn to each other and they look and they think, that's not really something I can imagine. 100 years' time? Nah, medicine man's got it wrong. So they go back to their normal lives. 100 years on, the city of St. Louis is now on their floodplains. The medicine man's prediction about how the climate would change held true. The Shawnee Indians were gone. But they weren't gone because of the climate. They weren't gone because they couldn't adapt to their environment. They were gone because white men put a bounty on their head, and individual white men and women took those Indians and gave them into the state to get their $100. Now, the city of St. Louis, for those of you who've been there, is a beautiful city. And many years on from that environmental story, the city stands on the banks of the Mississippi. But in 1993, there were some torrential rains that had never been seen before, at least not in the lifestyle or history of the reporting. And these rains broke the levees that were controlling the Mississippi. $12 billion worth of damage were done. 55,000 buildings were destroyed. 95,000 people became refugees. 50 people died. The hydrologist said, look, this is a 1 in 350-year event. We can recover, we can rebuild our city. And they did. They spent $70 million rebuilding new levees to control the Mississippi. They engineered structures to enable people to play along the sides of the Mississippi safely. They relocated people who were living in floodplain areas to new locations. And in 2013, when a second 1 in 350-year event came, this time the levees held. This time, the only people who were affected by the floods were the ones who hadn't listened to the engineers, the ones who had decided that they still wanted to live in their houses, however hard the government had made it for them to do so. So I want to think now about two different questions. Firstly, I want to think about the information that we need in order to think about change. So when the Shawnee Indians were given their information by the medicine man, they were told 2-degree change. The river is going to wash away your lands. Now you could argue that they weren't given information that was relevant to them. A 2-degree change, they probably didn't even know what 2 degrees meant. And even for us today, if we think about 2 degrees in the context of a baby who has a temperature of 38 degrees, going up to 40 degrees, 2 degrees is a lot. 2 degrees is a panic. 2 degrees is a trip to the doctor. But if we take one of the celebrity chefs and say, you've got to put your oven at 182 degrees versus 180 degrees, it's not going to mean much to them. They're going to think, it doesn't make any difference. And I, as a climate scientist, can think a 2-degree change in global warming, global temperatures. I'm thinking, wow, all that extra energy. You multiply 2 degrees by the size of the atmosphere, all that energy that has to be redistributed, all that influence on the rain and on the oceans as the globe tries to equilibrate itself. That's huge. That's enormous change. But I could also think, 2 degrees today might be a bit nicer to be 2 degrees warmer. So the information that we look for, or the information that we need in order to make our changes and to change our behaviour, can be quite important. As a climate scientist, I could give you facts and figures, but I think the essential message is that climates are changing, that we are changing our climates, but that it's very difficult to identify the cause and effect. It's very difficult to identify the effect of my action on the globe. It's very difficult to say that the things that I do have an effect. Why? Because the climate system is immense. It is so poorly understood that we have difficulty forecasting the weather. Still, often, our most accurate forecast is a persistent forecast, which essentially says the weather today will be the same as the weather tomorrow. We struggle to understand our climate system. But not only that, the way in which we understand the climate system and its impact on us is mediated by social, economic, political, and cultural circumstances. White man was able to adjust to changing climate. Technological fixes enabled white man to live on the levee. And it wasn't actually environmental change that changed the Shawnees' lifestyles. So we need to think about the information that we're given in order to make changes. My second point is in what we need in order to motivate change. If we've got the right information, we still have to change our behaviour. And I think there are 2 different types of behaviour change, or 2 different categories that this might fall into. The first is imminent risk. If you were living in those floodplains the first time it flooded in 1993, would you move or would you stay put? At a 1 in 350-year event, you're told it's likely to happen a 1 in 350 years. You might think, well, I've had my 1 in 350-year event. I don't need to move. And the trouble with science isn't just about facts and figures. We also need to understand how we value and the values and the meanings that we ascribe to those facts and figures. So actually a 1 in 350-year event doesn't mean it's only happened once in the next 10 years. It means that on average, over 1,000 years, it's only likely to happen 1 in 350 times. So we need to think about how we interpret the risk, what value and meaning we ascribe to our lifestyles. For some people, maybe they couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Maybe their homes, their history and their experience and their culture meant that it just wasn't possible for them to relocate. Sometimes too, when we're thinking about how we respond to imminent risk, We need to think about what technological fixes or what things might be around the corner. But it isn't just that either. Again, it's socially mediated. So that's motivation to change in response to immediate risk. But what about motivation to change in response to indirect consequences? In my story, I didn't offer an explanation for either why the climate was changing. The Indians were given a statement, the climate is changing. They weren't asked or told who was to blame. And when we're living with a pollutant where the indirect consequences are so subtle to identify, it's very easy to say, oh, perhaps this doesn't affect me, to find excuses as to why not to change our behaviours. If it's hard to see the impact of our actions, it's hard to make sacrifices as individuals or collectives to change those impacts. And I wonder if this is where we as Christians need to stand up and pay attention. Actions have consequences, and in this case, although the actions perhaps aren't as tangible as other pollutants, we do need to look for those consequences. If we think about the Industrial Revolution, we could see the pollution, the polluted cities, the factory outputs, the smoke from the chimneys. We could see that pollution. And the Clean Air Acts in the 1950s were an example of how we could deal with that pollution. We moved our chimneys downwind. We changed the ways in which we heated our homes. We created another problem, though, the acid rain problem in Europe from the long-range transport of the power stations created a new problem. We removed one and created another. And now we've dealt with the tangible pollutants, arguably in some places, we're still left with the intangible one, carbon dioxide. A gas that has very little, or has no smell, you can't see it, and yet it has consequences. So my final point is, how do we live our urban lifestyle in recognition of this? How do we accept our individual and collective behaviour has an impact? What can we do, living relatively privileged lifestyles here in Auckland, to try and mitigate that impact, accepting that most of the impact occurs away from where we are on people who have even less impact or less control over their environment? So I bring you back to the mind, body, community, environment links. And one of the ways in which, for one example, one of the ways in which we can think about this is to think about transportation. Globally, 1/5 of our greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels are from transportation. But in Auckland, if we were just to take 5% of our vehicle kilometres down, we would have a significant reduction in our global greenhouse gas emissions. What does that mean for most of us? That might mean that just 2 days a week, we might walk to work. We might bike to work. We might catch a bus rather than drive a car. And not only that, because of the mind-body environment connection, walking to work has a co-benefit. Our bodies will feel better if we're moving. It will have an impact on our healthcare costs because we are moving our bodies. We start to feel better in our minds because we're moving our bodies. And now we have an example where we have taken an indirect impact, an indirect consequence. We've given it personal relevance, and now we can say, this has an effect on me too, and I'm helping not only myself, my community, and my environment, but those who are tangential to it. We can argue there are lots of ways to promote this kind of activity, Fitbits, games, peer pressure. There are lots of ways we can encourage people to make small changes. And it does require some self-discipline. When my 6-year-old asks me for chocolate cake for breakfast, I say no. It's not a big thing for me, but it's a big thing for her. Self-discipline is required. We need to think about the world in terms of our guardianship, our stewardship, our love and responsibility for ourselves, each other, and the environment. And in doing that, we perhaps have taken some of the small steps towards thinking about how we manage and how we change our behaviour to be living in a responsible way to reduce the impacts of global warming. Thank you.